Hi there, I'm Cliff Warner. I'm the rector of Christ Church, and I want to tell you a little bit about the story of Christ Church. If you have been around us for very long, you might have heard the phrase, no one stands alone, and that really describes who we are. We want to see everybody stand in the company of Christ and his people. And that is both true of who we are, but it also is who we think about when we think about who we want to become. That is our vision, that everyone would stand in the company of Christ and his people around Austin, in Christchurch, around the world. And that's also part, as we look back at the story of Christchurch, that really characterizes different epochs and eras of who we have been. Christchurch goes back to the 1950s. And in 1950, Austin was a lot smaller. It was a little college town with a capital of the state, and those were the two kind of engines of the city. And there was a downtown Episcopal church called St. David's. It's still there, and they wanted to plant a church on the south side of the river. Now, back in that time, south of the river was the sticks. It was just far away, and there was a big divide. But there was a need for a church down there, so they planted a church on the south side of the river, and that became what is today Christ Church. But at the time, it was called Holy Trinity, and they met on South Congress Avenue. In fact, they met at a funeral home. That was the first location, a funeral home on South Congress. They eventually got some property over what is now I-35, and they were on the east side of I-35, the first exit south of the river. And so still very, very central, just within a couple of miles of downtown. And it remained there for a few decades. Small little parish, and they built a building that was up on a hill. And for years, it actually struggled quite a bit, and it would go up and down in numbers that ranged anywhere from a handful, literally, I'll tell you one story about that, to maybe a few dozen, and just hovered kind of in that range. And to get over the edge to be a sustainable parish was just difficult. Well, the story is that in the early 70s, it dwindled down to where there were only really 3 core members who were there regularly every week. And these were 3 older ladies that loved the parish, didn't want to see it go. The bishop was deciding that it might need to just dissolve as a parish. And they went down to Houston, where the bishop was, and prevailed upon the bishop and said, you must leave Holy Trinity. Please do not dissolve it. And they did prevail, and he relented, and it had another go of it. Still struggled, but for many years. But there was always a sweetness and a life and a love for Jesus. Even whoever was there, that was retained and sustained. In the 1980s, a man named Father Green came to the parish, and he was a good leader and a good pastor and priest. And one of the things that happened during his years, they got up a little bit larger, maybe 50, 75 people. And during those years, there was this growing ministry among the Spanish-speaking population. It got to the point that the Spanish-speaking congregation started worshiping in the building and started growing beyond, and actually way beyond, the English-speaking congregation. And around that congregation grew a larger ministry just to serve all the needs of this growing Spanish-speaking population in Austin. And what spun out of that is what's called El Buen Samaritano, and it is now, to this day, the largest ministry that is really seeking to serve the needs of the Spanish-speaking population in Austin, and with all kinds of social needs, and located in South Austin still. And so that spun out of our history and is part of who we are. So that parish was south of the river. It was on the east side of 35. And if you've been in Austin for a while, you know the history. East of 35, there was kind of a social precipice there as well. So both being south and east kind of put this parish in a place of being really able to love the neighbors. And many of the neighbors throughout the decades have been communities that are more marginalized or have different kinds of needs that the congregation was able to interact with, meet, get to know their neighbors, love their neighbors, and the congregation was also reflected by that. So really some beautiful years in ministry, always a little bit of a struggle for sustainability. Father Billy Dish then came in the 90s, and late 90s, early 2000s. He was here for about 12 years and really led the congregation to another level, kind of over the hump, and got up to about 120 people and got to that place where they were financially self-supporting and sustaining. They depended on diocesan kind of infusions financially to even survive, and now they were like a self-sustained congregation. They moved in what in Anglican terms is often called being a mission to a parish, and a mission is when a small congregation is still dependent on the diocese, and parish is where it becomes more independent. He led it into that stage. That was a major kind of moment. He retired in 2004. 2004 to 2006 were years of, again, struggle. It kind of shrunk back down to about 50 people or so. And again, even asking the question, the congregation at that time, should we continue? Should we try to make a go of it? Do we need to perhaps even dissolve? And so that was a struggle for a couple of years, what to do. And that's about the time that when the search committee and I started talking, and my wife and I came and our 4 kids in 2006. And after a couple of years of them being without pastoral leadership, it was a really big risk for the congregation and really a moment of boldness and faith. They didn't have enough money to support a full-time priest. They had some savings that would kind of support about 5 or 6 months. And so they just took a big risk and said, let's go all in. Let's do all the faith that we have, all the resources we have. Let's just make a go of it. It was a risk for our family as well, but for us, we saw that faith. We saw the kind of people that made up this congregation. They were servants. They were disciples of Jesus. They loved Jesus. They were full of hospitality. They welcomed the stranger. They welcomed the visitor. It was a rich and deep community. So we just saw a lot of health. And there was a really well-established healing ministry as well. Prayer for people whose lives were just in some part of their life broken and in need of inner healing, and they just this wonderful pastoral ministry of healing prayer. So we just saw these beautiful things, gospel things happening, and so 2006 we kind of all jumped in together and made a go of it to see if we could survive. And I tell some of that story just to say this has been a congregation going back decades that has just kind of had that sweetness about it, that centered on Christ value, and has lived with bold faith and stepped out in mission and risk throughout its entire life. So after a couple years, we began to see God bring some others along. There was no like dramatic growth, but over bit by bit, year by year, grew to the point where we were able to sustain ourselves as a congregation. 2008 was a crossroads for us. We had been part of the Episcopal Church all those years, and the Episcopal Church was going through a lot of change and had been for many years, and it all just was coming to a head, and there was a bit of a drift theologically from the historic biblical faith. And it was not where we as a congregation saw that the Lord was leading us. And so we left the Episcopal Church, and from one week to the next, started worshiping in a different location in that building, moved around. We're a mobile church for a while. What was really beautiful is that was just really the entire community. There was unity around that, unity around the gospel, around Christ, around the scriptures. And so those years were another moment of just seeing the faith, the risk, the boldness of the community. And then in those years, I'd say about 2008 and forward, the congregation continued to grow. We were able to add some staff and bring in another priest, keep growing in our mission to love the city of Austin and be reaching out and serving our city. We eventually planted a couple of churches. We, during those years, in the 2012-13, we sent out some people and a couple of retired priests to start a new congregation in at that time Sun City, and then they moved into Georgetown, and it's now Light of Christ Anglican Church in Georgetown. And that was a church plant. For a while it was a campus of Christ Church, and that was part of under our vestry, part of our budget and so on. It was called Christ Church Sun City, and then they became their own congregation as they gained strength and stability. So that was our first church plant. Another one came in 2015. A lot of big things happened in 2015. One of them was a church plant. That one we sent out about almost 100 people from our parish, and our associate at that time led a church plant that's now in Northeast Austin. It's called Church of the Cross, and they are just strong, thriving, doing well, beautiful congregation, Northeast Austin. So that's part of our heart, is that in our own individual lives, we would think about how can we be ambassadors of the gospel who are salt and light in our homes and workplaces all over this city. That we're not just a gathered community called Christ Church that just worships together on Sunday and all the life and the spirit as a church happens here, but how can it go from here there? And as we go out in our individual lives, as from gathered to scattered, how can we bear the light of the gospel? That congregationally, how can we look at what we have here and who we are and see about starting new congregations to be the light of the gospel in other parts of Central Texas? Part of our vision. I said 2015 was a big year. It was also a year in which we purchased a property. We went from being mobile church for about a decade, meeting in 4 different places, to finding a property in East Austin. Now, this was actually really important to us that it be central, in the central part of the city. It always, since the 50s, every location we'd ever had been within a couple miles of the center of the city. And that's because we feel really called to be salt and light in every arena of what goes on in a city like Austin, to be gospel bearers in the marketplace, government, the arts, education, health, nonprofit sector, neighborhoods. And right here where we're located, just a block off of I-35, if you look in one direction, you see downtown. And that represents just all the commerce and culture of our city. If you look in the other direction, it's a neighborhood. And you see families and individuals and friends and households. And this is our call to just love every individual, family, and neighborhoods. And we want to be a church that looks in both directions missionally. So we were really blessed to find this place, and God provided. It had been a church already for several decades, and so this ground has had gospel presence and witness in this neighborhood. We stand on the shoulders of faithful congregation and other leaders and lay people who just have been in this neighborhood trying to see God's kingdom come and will be done right here on the downtown east side as it is in heaven. So another kind of aspect, that's a big part of our mission and who we are. We have, over the past several years, really grown and strengthened some ministries that do this kind of gospel presence in our city, with things like our Faith in Business lunch, where people who are businessmen and women who are around this area can take lunch off or maybe come from downtown and think about, how do I integrate my life vocationally in the business world? Another area is the arts. We've got a robust group of artists. And artists, and we don't just mean professional artists, paid artists, but people who are art lovers and art makers, whether that's their primary vocation or not, but who gather and grow in understanding, how do I integrate this part of my vocation and calling in the arts? But also in all vocations, we have really pressed into as a church, what could it mean if every member of our church knew their vocation, knew what God had created them to do and be in this world, and identify that calling and then live it out intentionally in the name of Jesus in every arena of work around Austin. So this is all part of who we are, and right here in the downtown East Side, we want to love where we live, and especially those who are the most vulnerable or marginalized, or under-resourced. We're developing partnerships here in the neighborhood. Our strongest one right now is with a local elementary school where we've got mentors and volunteers as they have different needs to help them out in any way that we can. We just want to be a generative church. This is all part of the history of who we are, and you'll find at Christ Church a community of people that have been through a lot of crises, a lot of ups and downs. On a personal note, my wife was in a near fatal accident in 2015. That was a crisis for the church. And just to see the way the church came around us and this community and witness just the powerful work of God in her life, but also we as a congregation were shaped by something like that. But just any kind of moment throughout the life of the church where we hit a crossroads, we hit a challenge, we hit a crisis. I have found Christ Church to be a place ready to take a risk, ready to step out in faith, and very ready to trust God in the midst of the ups and downs, including 2020 and the year that it is, and the ways that it will become part of the history and story of Christ Church as it's told a decade from now. We want to be a generative people, generating new life wherever we are. We want to be a people centered around Jesus so that no one stands alone, but that everyone stands or has the opportunity to stand in the company of Jesus and in the company of his people.